Hey friends, welcome to another Before You Read lecture. This is a Before You Read lecture on the Epistle to the Hebrews, one of the general epistles found in the New Testament. What I want to do in this brief video lecture is provide a brief orientation to the writing of Hebrews, including a brief discussion of its literary style, what we know about the audience and the author. And then I want to highlight just a few things for you to pay attention to as you read, ways that you might engage it on your own so that we can have a rich discussion together afterward. The place to begin with a orientation to Hebrews is this idea of it as the riddle of the New Testament. This is a fairly old description of Hebrews, but it's an apt description. We know very little about the author or the audiences. We know it's hard to classify as a work of writing because it ends like a letter, but it doesn't have a letter's opening. Some have thought of it more as a theological treatise, like a heavy lifting sort of treatise. The only real clue about what it is that it's described as a word of exhortation in 13:22. In terms of its literary style, this is some of the best Greek that we have in all of the New Testament. It's a very sophisticated Greek. It's clearly relying on the Greek translation of the Old Testament, and it draws on imagery and metaphors and ideas from a wide array of different sort of originating contexts, from seafaring and farming to athletics. It is a beautiful and complex writing. There is this interweaving of exposition, so sort of theological discussion or practical discussion with exhortation, commands to respond in a particular way. Another reason we might think of Hebrews as the riddle of the New Testament is just a brief reflection that it had some trouble making its way into the canon. The earliest readers of Hebrews weren't always sure what to do with it. It did eventually make its way into the canon, but it tends to move around from different places in very early lists of the canonical books of the New Testament. It was quite early attributed to Paul, and there's a variety of really interesting sort of explanations about why Paul would write in this way and on these topics. And it is very well the case that in the West, at least, in the Latin-speaking church, that Hebrews made its way into the canon because of this association with Paul. In the East, in the Greek-speaking side of the church, there was less anxiety about that. And finally, the last thing that makes Hebrews sort of the riddle of the New Testament is its world of thought, the way that it thinks about the world and what it offers us. There will be, you will see, often a contrast between that which is visible and that which is invisible. And that which is visible is categorically less significant or less important than that which is invisible. And so there's, a visible worship of priests on earth, and there's an invisible worship of priests in heaven. Clearly, the heavenly is the better. There's a earthly law, but it's just a shadow of the true law. So this has led some interpreters of Hebrews to suggest that the world of thought is very similar to Platonism, to the philosophical system known as Platonism, which tended to say that the material world was second best and perhaps even dangerous to the spiritual world or the noumenal world. Others would say, no, this contrast between visible and invisible is also found in the biblical tradition and certainly in later Jewish apocalyptic texts. But again, there's a grittiness, a foreignness to the world of thought that I hope you will notice as you read. In terms of an outline for this writing from the New Testament, I think it's easiest to see some major breaks in the writing. So the first 4 verses are largely recognized as the prologue, as the sort of introduction or the preface, if you will, to Hebrews. And then in 1:4 through 13, we have the first chunk of material. And then there are these important hinge verses in 4:14 through 16, and again in 10:19 through 25. And these hinge verses are like a hinge on a door. They sort of connect the two parts, the major parts of Hebrews. And so the central section, or the main point, as it is called in chapter 8, is from 5:1 until 10:18. And this is the section that explores the priesthood of Jesus, the ministry, the priestly ministry of Jesus, and so forth. And so this is a chunk of literature, a body that seems sort of discrete, and it has this material on the front end and this material on the back end. And the material on the back end tends to be more in the language of exhortation and encouragement, and that central section has more to do with Jesus as a priest. And so one of the challenges I think about reading Hebrews is connecting the opening 4 chapters and the concluding 3 chapters with that central section. How can we read this from start to finish? How can we understand what the author is hoping to achieve from start to finish? Finally, give you just a few things to pay attention to as you read. The first is this idea that I call persecution as pilgrimage. One of the things that I see Hebrews doing, that I invite you to see with me, is that there seems to be persecution envisioned. It's a form of persecution that may be sort of verbal abuse, it may have been physical abuse, it may have been imprisonment, and maybe it has gone to the point of death, although that seems less certain. Certainly there's a general distrust among members of the community and their affiliation with this early Jesus movement. It seems that there was significant social ostracism and alienation that came both from associating oneself with early Christianity, but also withdrawing from the larger religious and cultural world of the ancient Roman world. And so they were perceived to be antisocial as a result of this lack of affiliation, and this led to persecution. And so one of the very interesting things that the author does is to recast the idea of wilderness wandering or pilgrimage as that experience that those who experience persecution are facing. So the idea here is we have this idea that all of life is Exodus, between our sort of initial redemption in Egypt, like the people of Israel, and the arrival at the Promised Land. Although in Hebrews, it's not Egypt and the Promised Land, it's sort of a life confined by a fear of death that eventually leads us into the city of God. And so Hebrews sort of imagines all of life as a journey with this ultimate destination. But part of this journey is experiencing sort of a fragmentation and a breakdown with the surrounding culture. The second thing that I would encourage you to pay attention to is the place to which they have come, the literal place, the place where they come to hear this letter read to them, the place that they have come to worship and be in fellowship, is a physical place. It's not just a spiritual place. And which I think highlights the precarious nature of gathering together. We'll talk about this in person, but in Hebrews 10:19 through 39, we get, I think, some of the clearest data about why Hebrews was written in the first place. And it seems as though people are saying, it's not worth the danger or the hardship of being a part of this community. And so they've begun to fall away. And so the author employs a tremendous amount of theological and rhetorical energy to remind them of just how significant it is for them to gather together and worship. And so pay attention to the sort of inflated and profound view of the church that we see in Hebrews. And then finally, Pay attention to the priestly benefits of Jesus and the future orientation. Pay attention to the already and the not yet that's in Hebrews, because it winds this tension between wanting to say, here are your benefits currently. Here are all of the things that you can do because of Jesus and because of his priestly ministry. And yet that present, that already, is not sort of replaced or second guessed to the hoped for future, the arrival in the city of God, and seeking the city that is to come. And so there is this interesting relationship between the already and the not yet that we see in Hebrews. All right, well, that is my before you read lecture for Hebrews. Clearly, I could say and would love to say more about it, but I think that that's enough for you to sort of get in there and dig around and see what you see in Hebrews. I look forward to hearing what you see in Hebrews. Now, happy reading.